Hi, this is the Retro Gaming. What do we call
Read
it
it.
again?
Script.
Script, please. Retro Gaming series, and Rebecca Heineman, who last I checked was me.
And Jannell Jaquays, who last I checked was me.
You sure?
No.
Okay. Well, where we came from, I've been in the video game business for over 30 years, and my claim to fame was in 1980, where sadly some of you weren't even born yet. I had won the National Atari 2600 Space Invaders Championship. Now, it was the first person to ever win a video game championship that was nationally held. From there, I went ahead and did a few video games, mostly for Avalon Hill Game Company. You may have heard some of them. For the 2600, they were Out of Control and London Blitz. I was one of the programs on them. There was two each for each game. Then afterwards was with a company called Interplay, where I did games like Bard's Tale. Worked on Wasteland, Out of This World, Wolfenstein 3D for the Macintosh. I pretty much wrote just about every game at Interplay for the first 5 years of its inception, and then I was a serious contributor of pretty much every game until I was no longer with the firm in 1995. That was 11 and a half years. And since then, I've been doing a lot of game series, mostly with Macintosh conversions. But really, I've been focusing on computer programming, doing games, more recently Borderlands 2, and was working with an indie studio doing Defense Grid 2 and Windborne, and that's a company called Hidden Path. And Jannell and I formed a video game company with two others called Old School.
Okay, and I'll do mine in reverse order. Hi, I'm Jannell. Currently, I'm the Chief Creative Officer for Old School. We are working on several titles right now, all secret. Before coming to Old School, I was the lead level designer on CCP's World of Darkness MMO, which is still ongoing in development. Prior to that, I worked as an environment artist, or just general artist, for Ensemble Studios on the Age of Empires 3 game and Halo Wars on the Xbox 360. I did Battlefield beautification. Prior to that, I was a level designer. I did software. Prior to that, I worked on Quake 2, Quake 3, Quake 3 Team Arena. Prior to that, I was an illustrator. I was an illustrator and artist for TSR, the publishers of game Dungeons & Dragons, which at this point, I'm going to jump backwards now because I actually worked for TSR at a midpoint in my career as on staff as an illustrator, but I got into this business through role-playing games back in the mid-70s, where in college, I published what would now be a website, a fan website. I published a fan magazine or a fanzine called The Dungeoneer and did about 6 issues of that and got my name out there among fans and game makers. Using that, when I graduated from college, I got into publishing in role-playing games, and I worked for a small publisher called Judges Guild. Did a couple of games that are still in print today, almost 35 years later, called The Dark Tower and the Caverns of Thracia for Dungeons & Dragons. Left there and eventually ended up as a contractor working for an East Coast toy company called Coleco. I went in on a 45-day contract to help them develop a role-playing game for a new piece of hardware that they were prototyping to make a toy out of that combined 2 really new and hot pieces of technology in late 1980. Speech chips, speech simulation chips, and barcode readers. They were putting them together to make a card reader that would read in a card and output speech. So another designer and I don't know if you're into science fiction writing or not, or science fiction or fantasy books, Michael Stackpole. He's published a few novels. I think he's up in his mid-30s or early 40s as far as books he's published so far. But he and I were brought in to be the designers for this project and see if we could come up with games that would sell this project internally, this barcode reader speech phoneme generator, into the company. Well, to make a long story short, the answer is no. We did our product, it didn't sell, but they liked us. They offered us both jobs on staff. Mike said, no, I want to go on and be a novelist. And you know, most people who make that career choice, that's, yeah, right, okay. Well, he did. I stayed and became a game designer at Coleco. I was there through this was before ColecoVision. It was after their football game. So they had a little handheld, electronic quarterback, I think was what it was called. It was in competition to a very successful product that Mattel had put out. So Coleco Me Too'd, which is kind of their style, or was their style. Wait for somebody else to establish a market, and then they jumped in and made a matching product. So they had the Telstar. They had already done the Telstar video game and gone through that. They were doing tabletop electronics. I showed up, they were working on kind of a modest-sized handheld that used a vacuum fluorescent display called Alien Attack. When I came on board, they had a big silver box about this big that just had LEDs laid out on it, and that was how we play tested. You played the game with this prototype, and while I was there, that was the first electronic game that I actually worked on, just mostly as a tester. The next products that came along are some that may be familiar to some in this room. That's their tabletop arcade games. The arcade industry was really starting to get popular. This was around 1981, or late 1891. Yeah, late 1981. They got the license, Coleco got the license to do Pac-Man on a big tabletop, or basically it's a handheld, but they turned it into a thing about this big.
It's a handheld that looks like a little arcade cabinet.
A little arcade cabinet. And I worked on that, designing the vacuum fluorescent display, working on gameplay for it, testing, writing documentations. What a game designer at a toy company did those days. We wrote documentation. So we worked on that for a bit, got that out there, and it did kind of a modest, I think it was something like 4 million units the first year, which was kind of got some attention for Coleco. It also made a god-awful noise when it played. If you can imagine the sound that the monsters make in the arcade game, but run it through a piezoelectric circuit. And put it this way, when I was working with an electronics technician at a later job, because I had a small child who liked playing this game, I had him disable the sound circuit. It was that, yes, it was that horrible. So we were working there, and during the early years of I was working there was some politics. A lot of people aren't aware of what went on inside Coleco. Apparently people describe it as a black box. Not a whole lot known about it. I worked in advanced research and development there. We were called ARD. I reported to a man who probably has some knowledge to game collectors and game historians. That's Eric Bromley. Eric Bromley was my boss. When I joined him, I hired on as a game designer. He was the director of advanced research and development. So we were doing these electronic titles, and I don't know the exact specifics, but there was some nice political plays going on inside the company between the engineering department and the advanced research and development department. The end result is that in this power play, my boss, who had like 15 to 20 people reporting to him, suddenly had 5, and that included his 2 secretaries. And then there was 3 or 4 of us who were designers. And we got shoved away in a closet, and that was pretty much, we figured, the end of our careers there. And then somebody in the company started noticing that these Atari guys were starting, and the television guys were starting to pull in a lot of money. And so that kind of triggered Coleco's Me Too. And they saw the cost of the chips, the parts that were going into the Atari product, and the cost of what was a 4K memory chip, which was not, they were still expensive at that time, but 4K was not as expensive.
Yeah,
and they said,
knowing what I know from Avalon Hill, because I was one of the programmers at Avalon Hill doing Atari 2600 games, and we were paying something like about $4 for 4K ROM at the time. And of course, we retailed the games for $50, so it was a good markup.
yeah. So Coleco saw money here. So they commissioned an engineer from the AR&D group and an engineer from the engineering group to come up with a spec for a product. And over the course of several months, they came up with what became the parts design for the ColecoVision, the TI video chip, and the Z80 processor, and a few other things that made the ColecoVision distinctly different from anyone else out there. And this made Coleco excited. And so we started doing the engine programming. We started doing, building the first prototypes, and designing we started some of the games in-house, and we contracted a number of them out. At this point, we went from being a few programmers and an engineer and a few designers to having to suddenly become one of the larger internal departments in the company. And so we just started growing. And I went from being a designer to being the most senior person on the design team, and then therefore by default the manager of the team, and therefore by default responsible for putting together the team. And at that point, there was no such thing as a video game designer. There was no such thing as a video game artist. And I needed both of them. So I worked with our HR people to figure out who would fill that bill, and I went with the people for design who I was most familiar with, and that was role-playing game designers. And while it's not well known who was on it, basically by the time I was staffed out, 8 out of, I think, the 10 designers who I had at any given moment came out of the role-playing game industry. Most of them from TSR, the publishers of Dungeons & Dragons, because conveniently for me, TSR had laid off most of their staff around 1983. So we collected a number of those guys, and because they were grossly underpaid, it was easier to grossly underpay them at Coleco. Yeah, the salary of a video game designer for an East Coast toy company in the mid-'80s was nothing to write home about.
Try being a programmer at Interplay, a startup in 1983. I got the name Burger Becky because all I could eat were 29-cent hamburgers on my salary, and I was a programmer.
Secret bit of information. I have to check her drawers to make sure there aren't any burgers in them now. Not those drawers.
You knew I was going there.
I knew you were going there. We put together a team of role-playing game designers. Well, the artists were even more challenging because there were no pixel artists in, at least not anywhere near we were at. Maybe out on the West Coast, Silicon Valley, where all the other game companies, in Los Angeles, where all the other game developers companies were being put together. But in Hartford, Connecticut, there wasn't much to choose from. So I ended up putting my first video game artist was a graduate from Pratt. He just graduated from college that spring. He could do art, hired. A couple more students from one of the local university. Okay, we can train you to do this, hired. House painter I met in, who answered one of our ads, hired.
Whereas at Avalon Hill, the way we did our art for our Atari 2600 games, we didn't hire anybody because we were that cheap, and we used a Lego flat piece and little square colored 4x4 Lego pieces and put them together, and once we got a piece of art that looked good, then I transcribed the bits, and that's how I got the art. They were made by Lego.
We were a little more higher tech than that. We used graph paper and markers. Eventually, I know, not worthy. Eventually, when we actually had the art department up and going, we had custom art paper made that matched the size of our a ColecoVision screen. So we had I think it was 200 by 300 sheet of graph paper printed up, grayscale, and every screen in the game was drawn by hand and plotted out with colored markers. And of course, we bought out we had 16 colors in the ColecoVision, so we bought up lots of markers in those 16 colors. And every piece of art that went through, we did not have a tool that did this. Everything was drawn by hand and then encoded into 8x8 bit blocks by hand, and then a second pass gone through. That was just to define the shape. The second pass defined the color. So part of the art job was eventually became creating all these data tables that the programmers would then use to create the artwork, using the hand-drawn artwork as a guide for what the art would look like in the game. And they got pretty good at that. One of our finds that we later acquired was an animator out of New York City. He had some professional animation credits. I think he'd worked on a movie called Raggedy Ann and Andy in the late 70s, and he ended up being the artist who did, I would say, 90% of the character of animation in all the ColecoVision games we shipped. And by the way, if it shipped through Coleco between 1982 and 1985, technically my credits should be on that game because it was my team. Some of them actually had more direct influence other than guidance, but I had to touch every one of them. So we had the team going. Eventually the art team split off from my group, and I was just purely responsible for designers and the technical writers who wrote the instruction manuals. That was another group we had. It was interesting to recruit because you had to hire these technical writers to write instruction manuals where we actually didn't tell anybody anything, because the whole theory behind our game manuals was the fun of discovery. We told you what the controls were, and here were these nice layouts of all the little layout sheets that went on, but we actually didn't give you any hints for playing. That was all up to you. And we went through that, for every game. And I will say one of the things that people wonder, well, how did you get your credits in these games? And the answer is we didn't. It wasn't until near the end of the Coleco, the whole run of Coleco, when we knew things were starting to wind down, and we were able to include some paper, fun, collectible things in some of the boxes. I think Tapper may have had one in it. There was a couple others. But we were able to put in credit lists of who had actually worked on the game. Not in the game itself, but in some of the documentation. I'm going to pass back to you for a while.
Yeah, whereas credits would have been on an Atari game, that'd be half my ROM space. Yeah, my video game starting in Avalon Hill was nowhere near as well organized as yours, because what had happened was that after I'd won the video game tournament in 1980, I was just a kid living in my bedroom in my parents' place. Excuse me. And I was flat broke. I came from a very, very, I had no money. So what happened was that I then, after saving my money, because I got the computer bug at school, because I saw this TRS-80, I said I really, really, really would love to get a computer. And it took me a very, very long time, including some of my video game winnings, to be able to afford to buy a used Apple II computer. And this is from some guy who had an ad at a recycler, and he bought the computer, only had it for a couple of weeks, and just wanted to get rid of it. So he sold it to me at a really good price, because Apple II computers at the time were like expensive. Well, now I have all my money in this computer, and I want to play games. So I was collecting cassette tapes and so forth. I had this Atari that I also bought to play games on, but I couldn't buy cartridges. I had to borrow cartridges from friends. But I discovered the magic known as BBSs, and I was actually to go to these bulletin board services using a modem to communicate, and was able to get documentation on how to copy cartridges. And I then learned all I could about my Apple II, and I actually designed a little board that lets me plug an Atari cartridge into the board, and I could download the cartridge to my Apple II and start saving them on the tape. Then later on, I amassed a very large collection of cartridge ROMs, but I realized, you know what, burning these EEPROMs costs too much money, because occasionally after you burn them like 20, 30 times, they die. So I designed this board that allows me to upload the ROM into this card, which then allows me to plug into Atari 2600, and I'm not burning a ROM. It just lets me instantly play the game. So at this point, the floodgates were open. I downloaded every game I could, had every friend I had to get me games, and I was playing video games all the time. Well, after I had won the tournament, I started writing articles on how to beat video games with Electronic Games Magazine, and I even co-wrote 2 books, How to Beat the Video Games and How to Beat the Home Video Games with a guy named Tom Hirschfeld. And that got me some fame and notoriety in 81, in which I just casually told my publisher that, oh yeah, I've learned how to program the Atari 2600. I reverse engineered the cartridge, and I told him all the stuff, and he's like, what? Who taught you this? Like, nobody. Okay. He drops my name casually to the owner of the Avalon Hill Game Company, a guy named Eric Dott. And he then got so interested, like, we want to get in the Atari 2600 market, but we can't hire an Atari programmer, because at this point in time, they're asking $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 just to even talk to them, let alone work for them. And I was this kid, who figured it out all on her own. So they called me up, and I said, yeah, and they hired me right there on that phone call. Just got a plane ticket, flew to Towson, Maryland, because I was living in Whittier, California, near LA. So here it is, I'm not even 18, and flying over to Avalon Hill, and I said, here's everything, here's the specs, and here's some sample cartridges I've written. With that, I then had to teach all these engineers who used to work for the Defense Department back in the 1980s on how to build these circuit boards, how to take their Apple IIs, their assemblers. Here's how the programming specs of the Atari 2600, and from that, we started making our games. And within 9 months, we actually had our first game. The first 2 was Wall Ball and London Blitz. And we got those 2 games out into the world, and they did actually quite well, which then they had more programmers come in, and we started doing Out of Control, Death Trap. There was one other game. And I also did a 6th game called Penetrator, which was kind of a Mega Mania ripoff, just a drop from the sky shooter. But I was recruited by Time Warner at the time. I still wasn't 18 yet. To do a cable TV box with an Atari 2600 cartridge thing inside of it. It's really difficult to explain how it worked. But so I told the guys at Avalon Hill, they're paying me actual money And because at Avalon Hill, to give you an idea, I was being paid $300 a month, and they gave me a room to live in at this house that we had. The lower floor was the Avalon Hill Game Company's tech department, and the upper floor, because this was a house, it was a very large house, the upper floor was just houses, some bedrooms and so forth. I had one of the bedrooms. So that's how I had no idea that this is how anything works. So I said, yeah, just give me a free place. And I never even talked to them about money. And they said, yeah, here's a stipend for you. And that's what I was doing. Now here it is, Time Warner saying, yeah, we'll pay you, you know, something like $3,000, $4,000 a month. And I'm like, 4,000? You didn't say 400, right? $4,000? Wow. So took the job, worked on it for 3 months, and then the project gets canceled. That was a bummer. But here it is. I then get back home. I still occasionally talk to the guys at Avalon Hill because every now and then they call me and says, hey, how does this register work? So it's like, oh yeah, you do this. It's like, oh, how do you do the sound thing that you did in this game? Oh, like this. It's kind of fun. But then went back to the West Coast, and then at that point I then went to visit Atari, and they said, oh, you're available? Come work for us. And so I took a job at Atari, thinking, my dream job, I'm going to finally work at Atari, and I'm actually going to get like money and so forth, you know, because, you know, 3 months at Time Warner said, I can actually get paid for this? Wow. But then they laid off everybody in 3 weeks. Everybody. Nothing more fun than walking into a building and then hearing people crying. And they're like, what's going on? And wait a minute, why is Bob not at his, why is this desk empty? What's this envelope on my table? Oh, I'm unemployed again. Gee, that's common. Is this going to happen all the time in my career?
This might be a good kind of tag team then.
Oh yes, okay, tag team to you.
Okay, since we've got around to endings, I guess that's the best way to put it, is endings. By the way, I don't know if you knew this. It was Eric Dott was one of your bosses, wasn't it?
Jack and Eric Dott, they were the owners.
Somewhere around 1983 or so, I interviewed Eric Dott for a game design position at Coleco. I also interviewed Orson Scott Card, but that's another story. So we had, Coleco, we got going pretty strong right out of the start in the early 1982 doing cartridges. We did 1 or 2 inside. We did Donkey Kong inside. We did the Smurf Adventure inside. But most of our titles were done by contractors outside who we provided material to. So a lot of what my people were doing, today's position would be described more as an associate producer. They were handling these companies, these developers, the relationship with these developers outside, writing the specs and then handling the relationship with the developer. Not their money, but getting the product done. So we had all these, so typically a game designer would have anywhere from 3 to 4 projects going simultaneously. One at the design and analysis stage, because that's how we did our cartridges. We got these arcade units delivered to Coleco. Usually one was delivered to Coleco, one was delivered to our, the contractor who'd be working with us, and then somehow there was always a third one that ended up in the basement of one of the vice presidents of the company. I don't know how that worked. So we would play the video games and do timing and analysis of them. There would be no specs or code dumps or anything like that. So if a game played like, if you thought a ColecoVision game played like the original arcade, it's because we analyzed it, not because we didn't simulate it. We worked to create that code through analysis and documentation, and that's how we started it. And then we turned that documentation over to the artists who did all the coloring book drawings of pixel by pixel of all the art. And then finally, I had to sign off on every single one of those pieces of documentation. Somehow that ended up being my job, was the sign-off person. And so everything passed through me. We'd go out to the developer, and then the developer would start sending us code drops back. Most of the time that worked, because we get the code in, we'd verify it, we'd test it in-house, we get a final code, ship it off to be manufactured. And it worked pretty cleanly, doing the cartridges. One of the things that Coleco discovered early on, that they felt there was almost kind of a bait and switch. I think they kind of didn't realize was coming. The Atari cartridges were done on 4K ROMs for a modest one. Donkey Kong originally shipped on 16K. That was a lot of money in 1982's times.
16K on the ColecoVision.
On the ColecoVision was 16K. And when they were pricing out Coleco and everything, the cost, they hadn't realized this. In fact, actually, Donkey Kong shipped on 24K. We didn't get it down till 16, till later, and then we shipped it out to have it rewritten in machine code, and finally got it down to an 8K part.
One thing to remember is that during this time is just because something is twice as big doesn't mean it's twice as much money. It's actually 3 times as much money. When we did a cartridge that was 4K for the Atari, we were being asked around $4 for the one part. But when we were trying to do a game at Avalon Hill that was about an 8K cartridge, we were asked to pay $10 a cartridge.
Oh my God.
Part. So I can imagine going to the 16K or the 24K route, the price was going to the point where Coleco wasn't probably going to make much money at all if they once they sold the cart.
Probably not.
What was it, like $39.95 or $49.95?
I think they were in the $50 range.
Mm-hmm.
I think cartridges have almost stayed pretty consistent in cost over the years. It's just the value's gone up.
It's also amazing. This is $50 of $1980.
Right. So we were doing most of our product out of house, and through '83 we started working on the Atom computer, and that's really a completely different storyline. But in-house we were developing the Atom computer, and that's what then we ended up with over 140 people in-house on staff in the what was now electronic development group. We had actually, instead of being overtaken by engineering, we had gone and taken all of engineering's people as we grew. We grew to a large art department. We had all our services in-house, so that they were programming the game in-house. They were working on the computer in-house. While my group was mostly working with outside contractors and a couple of teams inside at any given moment. We get along into the everyone's familiar with the crash. If you're no game history, you know the crash. Well,
To be specific, in 1983, because of a game called E.T. and another one called E.T. and Pac-Man from Atari, it flooded the market and people stopped buying video games literally overnight. And by 1984, majority of the video game companies of the time were gone.
One of the things, though, is this was very apparent to people in marketing and senior executives. It was not so apparent to people working in the trenches on the product. We had a pipeline full of product that we were cranking through, and we saw no end of our work for years to come. Except around late 1984, we started getting rumblings from people in-house and long faces. And then I got asked, September, October period, I needed to prioritize my people and make a list of, if I were to let people go, who would go. And I did. And over Thanksgiving, while I was visiting family back in Michigan, I heard from one of my staff that one of my designers and at least one of the artists were let go. Okay, well this is, okay, a little bit of bloodletting, we're okay here. And then we pushed hard to get ready for the Consumer Electronics Show. Consumer Electronics Show, the January show in Las Vegas, was our big show every year. So there was a big push for us through the holiday period to actually get product ready to show the first week of January, which sometimes meant encouragement not to take vacation around Christmas, which is kind of the opposite from everybody else in the industry. So we were asked to stay, stay close to home. But that year, we'd matured in our cycle, and I was able to let some people go home. I stayed working on my product line. This was Christmas 1984. Christmas, we still had most of our team intact, but everybody came back after we had a Christmas break, and we came back, and January 2nd was the first work day of 1985, and Human Resources came through and rounded up half of the electronic development group, took them across the street to a theater that was across the street from Coleco, and informed them that they were now all unemployed and that they could schedule a time to come back to their desks with HR that day. My brother was actually in the QA department then and got that message. It also happened to be his birthday. So that was the end of his career in the video game industry, unfortunately. So we were down to half staff. I actually had to take a phone call from one of my designers. He had gone back to visit family back in Wisconsin. And, what was that sign? He had gone to visit his family back in Wisconsin. And he goes, well, do I still have a job? And there was this pregnant pause, and I had to say, no, Phil, you don't. So that was kind of the worst moment of that. And then over the next 6 months, it was a matter of letting people go person by person. I had to make up a list. I prioritized people as projects finished. I let people go. Sometimes people are able to transfer to some other groups, like the education group. I had one guy come up to me and said, I want you to know, I'm going to quit. He goes, I found another job with another company, and I'm going to go take it. And I said, no, Joe, don't quit. Let me lay you off. And so he became my sacrificial victim that week. And it went that way through the next several months. We had one woman who couldn't be let go because she was on maternity leave. The minute she came back, gone. I was on jury duty for a month, and I think that kept my entire team. That's another story. Jury duty in Connecticut was a month, and you went to the courthouse and stayed there. So I think that kept my team employed for the month of May. Then came along June. I was home, sick in bed on a Friday, and was told, you need to come in because we're laying off you and the rest of your team. And that was the end of my time at Coleco. And
they replaced you with the Cabbage Patch doll.
The Cabbage Patch dolls were already in place, and actually, personally, I blame the Cabbage Patch Kids for the final end of Coleco, not the Atom, or there may have been some there, and definitely not video games. We're coming up close. We're about 10 after, so.
So, do you want to go to questions, or is there any more last things I should mention?
Why don't you tag team, because unless you want to go on to the beginning.
Tag team was, well, I'm going to skip over a lot of crap, but essentially is one of my other claims to fame was that the game, you may have heard of Bard's Tale. It's a classic RPG done on the Apple II C64 et al. It was originally conceived of by a bunch of people at Interplay, and I did the tools and I did the all the ports, because the original game, the logic was done by a guy named Mike Cranford, and I did all the graphic routines and the tools and so forth. But then after we shipped Bard's Tale 2, Cranford was no longer working on the project, and I said, I want to do this. I want to take it over. So I did Bard's Tale 3. I wrote every line of code, got together a crack team with Michael Stackpole, who used to work with you
I know him.
as the writer. And I did, it's the game that had like female characters. It had a huge storyline, skill-based combat instead of class-based combat. It was a vast thing, and it was so popular, it ended up in a Smithsonian exhibit. And I still remember one of the things was, originally with Bard's Tale 1, I said, why are there not female characters? And Mike Cranford looked at me with a straight face and says, girls don't play these games. And I'm like, okay. But of course, you know, as soon as I took it over, girls were in there and they were well represented. So, and then afterwards I followed up with a game called Dragon Wars, which was originally, its code name was Bard's Tale 4, but we found we really couldn't use the name Bard's Tale, so I had to rename the game, change the scenario. But if you did want to see what I would envisioned as what Bard's Tale 4 would have looked like for look and feel, play Dragon Wars. It's a very underrated game and shipped, and I did all the ports. I did Apple II, 64, C64, etc. So since we're running out of time here, anybody have any questions for the
One last thing. There was a Bard's Tale 4. I actually was one of the designers on it, working as a contractor for Interplay. It never shipped.
Actually, it was EA.
That's right. I'm sorry. It was EA. It was too easy to say Interplay. It was working for EA as a contractor in the early 90s, and it just got bogged down. And they took it in a different direction. I came in to basically be the script doctor.
And then I wrote Dragon Wars by myself and kicked all your asses.
Yes, you did. and that was pretty much my last fanfare of working in the computer game industry for another 6 years. Okay, so we'll do questions. If you've got questions, please line up in front of the mic.
You got questions. We got answers. It looks like you got a question.
I just want to say Bard's Tale is the series that got me into computer role-playing games.
Awesome.
So I'm happy to hear that. I hope you really enjoyed the games.
Yes, I did.
And that you don't blame us for that lost part of your life.
No.
And we had nothing to do with that In Exile game that was done in 2004 in name only.
And my question is, what are your favorite projects that you remember that never actually saw the light of day for whatever reason?
Oh, boy. Things that... Thankfully, I actually finished the games and get them shipped, but there have been projects I worked on that never saw the light of day, and unfortunately, the one I really wish would ship, I still can't talk about. But the one I can talk about, let's see here. I'm trying to think of something that actually didn't ship. Why don't you take that question?
Okay. One of the things that Coleco did when they set up the box cover for ColecoVision back in 1982 is they came up with a lot of ideas for possible product. Some of them were arcade, some of them were original titles, some of them were licensed. We talked with a couple of role-playing game companies, including Flying Buffalo and Steve Jackson Games, and one of the products we featured on the cover of the box using cutout paper. They did all that art, not with pixels, not with hand-drawn. It was done with paper cutouts to create those screens that have ended up in the box cover. But we did Tunnels and Trolls as a possible title. It was there on the box cover, Tunnels and Trolls, the role-playing game from Flying Buffalo. And that was the end of it. We had the license. We did nothing with it. So there was a group internally around, this is 1984 time period. We actually designed the beginnings of the game. We started creating the user interface, the character creation screens. They're actually floating around somewhere out in the, in the web or in the BBSs is the demo that we put together on the Atom computer that showed where we were thinking of going with Tunnels and Trolls on the Atom computer. It never happened.
Okay, I got the answer now.
Okay.
The game was, we were doing, after leaving Interplay, co-founded a company with a friend called Logicware. And at the time, Doom was a big game. And we thought, wouldn't it be nice if we did a game with the Doom-ish engine and did it with a swords and sorcery fantasy game, kind of like Bard's Tale. We called the game Sorcerer's Realm. And we actually made a demo movie, and we had just a prototype level, and how the wizard would be firing magic bolts and so forth, and with all leveling systems. And then just when we were about ready to start pitching it to publishers, we heard the news that Heretic and Hexen were coming out.
Oh.
At that point, said, "That's it, we're done."
Okay. Next question.
Yeah, I was actually kind of interested. I heard you said that you worked on Age of Empires 3.
Yes, I did.
I'm kind of interested. What can you tell me about the development of that game?
I came into the game probably about a year into development. I had been on a second team at Ensemble. I'd been on a prototyping team for about 2 years. So when I decided I wanted to go back to being an artist from being a designer, I shifted over to working on that team. I'm not certain, that's kind of a really general question. Specifically, I worked on the home city interface. I did probably about half of the home cities that appear in Age of Empires 3. Built the models, did the scene layouts, did the setup for them, and then did a lot of play testing. And then specifically also then I worked on the expansion pack, the War Chiefs. Mm-hmm. Is there a specific question you're looking for, or because I was not a designer, I was an artist on that team.
I guess I really don't have any specific ones about it. So.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it afterwards if you just want some general. You have other questions.
First of all, thanks to both of you for coming here and sharing your story. It was
Oh,
really
thanks.
interesting
No
to
problem.
hear. I had a really specific question for Rebecca, and
Sure.
I understand in your credits here that you worked on the Super Nintendo port of Out of This World.
Yes, I
Very,
did.
Influential game. Sorry. I bought it at a game shop a while ago. Picked it up, started playing it, and it's not going too well. I'm having a really hard time not getting killed instantly by the first monster. Can you tell me what I need to do?
Okay, if you're talking about as soon as you teleport into the new world,
Okay, I'm in
you're
the new
wandering
world,
around,
gotten out of the
you
water.
see the monster just appears and starts chasing you.
Yeah, he chases me.
Okay, he starts
Then I
chasing.
die.
Yeah, well, as soon as you see him, you just run the hell away. The
Okay.
trouble is that when you are running, there's going to be a cliff.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you get to the edge of the cliff, you press fire to jump.
Okay.
And then there is this rope. The rope will jump out, swing one way, and it swings back. At the apex, you press again, and it'll let you jump off the rope, which will put you on the other side of the monster.
Okay.
You run like hell.
So then
You just keep running, because afterwards,
And you have to like jump over some like rocks.
there's just those little worm things on the ground.
They kill me too.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that if you push down and then fire, it will kick, and
Oh,
it will
okay.
kill them.
All right.
So, but you do that before the bear thing shows up. But then once you run off, keep running to the left, but then sooner or later you get to the first screen you were in. As soon as you try running off the edge of the screen, which you couldn't before, this time, as soon as you run to it, someone punches you, and you fall to the ground,
Yeah.
and then a laser comes and shoots the monster. And next thing you know, you wake up in a jail cell.
Okay.
That's what happens next.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I know there's like FAQs and everything on the internet now, but I figured, I saw your name on the list. There's no better person to ask.
Yeah, there's a story behind the entire development of that game, because the Super Nintendo version wasn't even going to happen until I did a proof of concept on an Apple II GS.
Yeah.
Because originally the game was written on the Amiga using the blitter and stuff, so I thought you needed an Amiga. There's no way in the world this game would run on anything less than an Amiga. So as I look at the guy, like, yeah, I could do that on my Apple II. It's like bullshit. So I took the source code, spent like 2 weeks on it. I had the first entire level of the game done, working at like 10 frames a second, which isn't that impressive, but it was working on an Apple II.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, this is my first pass. I'll easily get this to 30 frames per second. Just give me some time. And they're looking, I was like, could you do that on the Super Nintendo? I said, yes. A week later, here's a prototype Super Nintendo. It's running at 10 frames per second.
It looks
Actually, it was
good.
15. Oh, there was some programming trips in there. But
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why the game's letterboxed.
Okay.
Fewer pixels, so I got the frame rate up that way.
Thanks for humoring me. I'm going to try that tonight.
Yeah, the letterboxing is
see
a
how far I
common
can
trick
get.
in older games.
I've really wanted to play it for a while. I've heard about so much about it being so influential in the art style.
Yeah, well,
Looking forward
I'm the one who
to-
wrote that.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks. One more question? Yep.
I have a question about coming from this team you had, coming from like TSR and places like that, where you're illustrating for TSR, sky's the limit. You can, your imagination. Going from that to these pixel graphics, was that like a limitation for a lot of the artists, or being a writer and coming to game design and writing? How was that a creative limitation or just a challenge to?
Well, there was a couple of things going. One, yeah, it was limiting from doing that, but I think they understand that this, you have to kind of view this in context of the time period. When we were working on ColecoVision, around that time, the movie Tron came out, which was kind of this, we saw, this is what computer graphics could be someday. But the reality was, we were working with 16 bits in we had 16 colors, and we could put them together with 32-bit sprites. So it was learning how to be creative within limitations, and we generally found that wasn't as limiting as we thought it would be. The other side of it is for most of us, we were making real money for the first time, and that was a good thing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, being able to eat, what a concept.
I just wondered what it was like in the climate of the industry for women in the early 80s, if there were a lot of women that were working in the industry, or if you found yourselves to be the only ones oftentimes.
I was alone.
This is actually different. There was actually a change. At least half the artists that I hired at Coleco were female. We had a lot more women working in the industry in the early 80s than we did later on. Now, Coleco was a very misogynist company. I mean, there's no question on it. It was, you had all the rich old men in Mahogany Row running the company, and their high-priced secretaries. But beyond that, women weren't treated well in the company. But where we could, we were gender blind in hiring. We had female programmers working on staff. We had a lot of female artists. Not so much on the design side. I think I had one. Our technical writers was a mix of men and women. So it was actually more balanced back then. And I was kind of surprised when I got back into the industry in the late 90s down in Texas, and it was a complete boys' club, completely.
I found that the gender mix is a geographical, it really has a high influence, like in the case of the company she was mentioning was in Dallas. In Texas, I found predominantly it's a boys' club. On the West Coast, it tends to be more fair and mixed. On the East Coast, it's really a matter of who's in charge of the company. If the person in charge is a boys' club person, and it's boys' club all the way down. Whereas some firms I've worked with on the East Coast where they have a very fair CEO, it's mixed all the way in. So it's kind of like weird where some companies you go in there and it's like, where are the women? And the other one's like, women everywhere. So it's just strange. But I do recall, it does bring up a little funny story here, was that at Electronic Arts, we had this little in-joke with my team because I was the senior engineer. So if you ever came to my cubicle, I was just filled with all this equipment and high-tech crap. And so they would come in with the new employees and says, okay, here's such and such. He's an engineer. Here's a such and such. This person. Well, here's Becky. What do you think she does? Let's see. I was the receptionist. I was the office manager. I was the art director. I was the sound engineer. I think no one ever said, you're the lead programmer or programmer in any capacity, despite the fact my desk was covered with readouts and just printouts and stuff everywhere. But I did remember one engineer who goes like, oh, are you the office manager? So it's like, oh, yes, yeah, I'll get you your coffee, but after you report to me for work on Monday.
Thank you.
Yeah, shade of white. That was a good one.
Unless there's one really short question.
That was 9 months. It went from concept to completion 9 months. What happened was that when I did for Bard's Tale 1 and 2, I took the game engine that Cranford did. I mean, just the logic. All the other stuff was my own code. I took his black boxed it, and then did a wrapper for doing the 2GS, the Atari, the other versions. But then when I went to Bard's Tale 3, I just scrapped all of Cranford's code. Every line of it gone. Rewrote an entire new game system. And it took about 3 months. And at that point, then I just re-engineered all my tools, which is what we use to do the maps and so forth. So we're all multi-size and everything. But because it was all modular, the way I designed the engine, it allowed me to back convert Bard's Tale 1 and 2 for the 2GS. If you've ever played Bard's Tale 1 and 2 for the Apple 2GS, that's using the Bard's Tale 3 engine inside. It's all Bard's Tale 3 code. That's why Bard's Tale 1, 2, and even 3, which I never released for the GS, are all my code. There's none of Cranford's codes in it. But yeah, it was from start to finish. It was about 9 months. And Dragon Wars was another rewrite, which I just did a clean sheet engine. That was another 9 months, and I got that one out.
Which incidentally, that was the life cycle of a ColecoVision game. 9 months from the point that we got an arcade in-house to when we were shipping code.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, in closing, there's one, like you said, you wanted to know what games that I wanted to ship but never did. Another one came to mind. Harry Potter's Wizard's Chess. My company came up with the concept right after the first movie came out. And one of the things I never mentioned was that I was the one of the authors of Battle Chess. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we took Battle Chess, put it in the Harry Potter world, and then did the houses and everything like that? We had a full pitch, did all the mock screenshots of it, went up to Electronic Arts, and it says, "Who are you? Why would we ever want to do business with you?" And it says, "What makes you think we're not working on such a game?" And we all went like, hmm. But it would have been really, really nice if we got a chance to do that game. I would have loved to have done it.
Who knows?
Who knows? Mm-hmm. So I think we're out of time.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful audience. Thanks.